I know. It's actually really bad, but that spot is the worst. Okay, thank you. So my name's Jeremy Wildeman, and I'm one of my specializations is Middle East Studies. I'm an instructor at Carleton University. I'm a fellow at the Human Rights Center at the University of Ottawa, and I have a few other affiliations. But this isn't about me. I'm your moderator. This is about our brilliant panel, and we're going to explore a topic that is very appropriate for Canada, and it's looking at the path forward to balance interests and uphold values in the new Middle East. So we got a sense of that new Middle East through the panels that have been, through our work and through the panels that took place today. But there's that question, there's that underlying assumption too, when you talk about balance of interests and upholding values, are they separate? From a realist perspective, they're often considered to be separate, but are they? And that'll come up amongst our panelists today. We have with us, and to keep things brief, Timothy Kaldas, who is the Deputy Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. You're also an adjunct professor at the International Relations Autonomous University of Barcelona. So thanks, Timothy, for being with us. We have Arif Lalani, a former Canadian ambassador to Jordan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the UAE, and a distinguished fellow, the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and a senior advisor of StrategyCorp. And Arif is online, and I hope I pronounced your name correct. We have with us also Andrea Prasow, and she's the executive director of the Freedom Initiative. And we have with us at the end, Michael Youash, who's the senior manager of global analysis, the Global Center for Pluralism. So thank you very much for being with us. I have some opening questions for each of you that we agreed to prior to the panel, acting as your sort of introduction to the topic. Timothy, we'll start with you. So I wanted to ask you, this conference is taking place in Canada, a country that often refers to its foreign policy as being values-driven. So this is something we often seen. Doesn't matter to the Prime Minister, doesn't matter to the government. For as long as maybe any of us remember, Canada's talked about its foreign policy being values-driven, at least back to the Pearsonian era in the 1950s. Regardless of government and power, Canada also has a long-standing international image as a peacemonger, a human rights defender. Speaking to the theme of this panel and where it's taking us, where it is taking place, how do you see countries in the West that consider themselves to be liberal democracies like Canada, balancing their desire to pursue both their interests and maintain their values in this new Middle East? And with a country like Egypt in particular, I know you will have other examples, but like Egypt in particular, where the Western alliance system, which the Western alliance system considers strategically important, but whose system of governance is characterized by significant human rights issues, which in theory would be a problem for a country like Canada, who would see its foreign policy as being values-driven.
Thanks so much, and I join everyone else in thanking IPD for welcoming me here and for all of you sticking it out. I apologize in advance for any incoherence. It's midnight for me. I'm a little jet lagged, but it's a pleasure nonetheless. So thank you, Jeremy. I think I would argue that I think that we need to kind of reimagine the extent to which it's balancing values and interests, and to what extent values can inform interests. I think last week I was locked in a basement in Rome with a bunch of North Africa directors from various European countries and some analysts, and we were talking about different issues that they're dealing with and challenges that they're facing. And fundamentally, one of the major kind of objectives for them in a number of North African countries was how to achieve stability. We have a number of countries that are at risk of default, facing extreme governance challenges, and deteriorating standards of living, raising prospects of elevated risks of political instability and unrest. These things are related to a failure of those governments to comport with the values that we actually want to see. Poor governance, poor rule of law, a lack of access to information have undermined growth, have undermined job creation, have undermined the prospects of an inclusive economy, thus increasing social tensions. And at the same time, I mean, I thought it was interesting that one of the ambassadors earlier was worried about foreign interventions. One of the greatest risks to Egypt for foreign intervention is the fact that the leadership has leveraged the state so recklessly that it is ranked, according to Bloomberg a few weeks ago, the second most likely country to have a debt crisis in the world. And that vulnerability has fundamentally undermined Egypt's geopolitical strength, its ability to resist external pressure, and additionally has resulted in a situation where it has an IMF program that is predicated on asset sales to 2 or 3 Gulf countries. So it's basically selling public assets under duress. And the leadership is understandably resistant to that, but they've created that situation for themselves. But we've also helped them do it by not making sure governance was better built into a lot of the international financing that was going towards Egypt, by not doing more to make sure that the EBRD comported with its mandate, which says that you need to have rule of law, you need to have a movement towards multi-party elections. You need to, or if you're regressing in terms of your rights and rule of law, that will reduce our engagement. But instead of that, EBRD actually made Egypt its first and second most largest country of engagement for the last several years. So the result was that Egypt had extraordinary access to capital with no scrutiny, with no rules, and we watched them light the country's money on fire, I mean, for lack of a better word, building the tallest tower in a brand new city in the middle of the desert with no density, the tallest tower in Africa, sorry, the longest monorail in the world. It's not Disney World, guys. It's not necessary. While poverty rose and Egypt's economic stability was compromised. And we helped facilitate that. I think, and the blame still is with the leadership. Don't misunderstand me. I mean, they're ultimately the decision makers here, but we didn't have to make it easier. We didn't have to invest in it. And so I think that if we start to think a little more critically and frankly develop more sophisticated approaches to how we engage with our partners, we can see that our values can inform more stabilizing policies, more stabilizing support. And I think while some people see transactionalism as a dirty word, I view it as a form of transparency in policy engagements. I think that being transparent about what it is that you want from your partners and why you're giving them things is actually a healthy form of communication that is often lacking. And there's a lot of like signaling and posturing and pretending that we're just doing this because we're friendly and we're generous, but we're not, and they know that. And also they get kind of confused when we pretend to be, but then we're wildly inconsistent in terms of the application of our commitment to our values. And that's another challenge. I mean, as the U.S. seeks to differentiate itself from its rival powers in kind of growing power competition globally, and argue that it's committed to a rules-based system, I heard a lot of people talk about that today. It would be really helpful if the U.S. committed more to rules, and it would be really helpful if they were more consistent in their application of their views of the rules with their partners, because there is a perception, based on evidence, that when it comes to our partners, we're a lot less concerned about their violation of the rules, and we're a lot more concerned when we see our rivals violate the rules. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned when our rivals violate the rules. Iran's behavior in the region is damaging, illegal, all the rest of it. But so are many of our partners. I mean, the UAE has also been a destabilizing force in parts of the region. The Saudis have been destabilizing in parts of the region. We've helped facilitate some of those things in Yemen, for example. And if we want to be consistent, if we want to see that kind of differentiation in the competition with our rivals, I think that that's also something that we need to keep in mind. And I would just also add that when you provide, I see kind of political economic thinking as an important vehicle for how we envision the bridging of the gap between values and interests. Because I think the securitized perspective on foreign policy in the region has helped kind of justify a lot of unsavory decisions. And I also think that there's also kind of an institutional cultural issue with the way that we approach foreign policy thinking. I've noticed a lot of policymakers appeal towards a realpolitik, a dependence on material interests, as though they're being, they're more realistic, they're more pragmatic, but in reality, they're often not very good at it, I have to say. I think that that's one of my frustrations, is that they justify departures from our values based on this idea of realpolitik, but in practice, they're not even achieving the outcomes that they've set out to achieve, but they're sacrificing their values in the process. And they think that they're these realpolitik chess masters, but they're actually pretty consistently not, I think, getting either their interests or their values addressed. And I think the latest example of that is the U.S. decision to not withhold the vast majority of the foreign military assistance that was conditioned on human rights progress in Egypt using a national security waiver. The U.S. had withheld larger amounts in the past couple of years without any significant deterioration in the bilateral relationship. Intelligence cooperation continued, cooperation on counterterrorism continued, the U.S. continued to enjoy privileged access to the Suez Canal, overflight rights. Obviously, Egypt wasn't going to war with Israel, so Camp David remained intact. I wasn't really worried about that. I don't know if anyone should be at this point. Egypt can barely control Sinai. It's certainly not going to go war with Israel. So that's off the table. So we weren't losing anything. And we were gaining in the sense that the pressure was actually mounting on Egypt. We were gaining credibility in that we were actually finally seemingly committed to this condition on our foreign military assistance being real, because for the last few decades, it's not really been a thing. It's always been waved out. It's always been ignored. And the Egyptians were releasing prisoners, admittedly, also arresting more of them, which is why the assistance should not have been dispersed. But they were feeling pressure, and the indictment against the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that came out this week, indicating that Egypt allegedly tried to bribe the senator in order to try to corrupt a national security decision on the dispersal of these funds, speaks to how important it was to them. For those who say, oh, the $235 million didn't really matter, we weren't accomplishing anything. Well, apparently they cared. So yeah, I think we could be more realistic than the realpolitik argument suggests at times. And that's not to say that there's never going to be a conflict between values and interests, but I think that oftentimes it's exaggerated and people aren't thinking through more creative ways of bridging the gap between the two.
Timothy, sorry to move you along. Thank you. So it's an interesting comment. To be more of a realist, maybe you should be a political economist. It's kind of your message there.
I'm biased. I'm a political economist.
Okay. Just very quickly before we went to Arif, I want to ask, who is we?
I would say like-minded states, largely in the West. But even, to be honest with you, even in the case of some of these instances, we've seen Gulf states want to emphasize some of these governance issues in the IMF deal with Egypt. It's not, there's plenty of times where they're violating our values, don't misunderstand me, but I don't think that it needs to be strictly a domain of the West.
Thanks so much. Okay, Arif, I hope I'm saying your first name correctly. Just going to go to you online, and it's a very interesting follow-up to Timothy, just from our conversation together. Since this conference is taking place in Canada, and given your distinguished career working on behalf of Canadians overseas, I want to ask you a question specific to Canada. Canada often refers to its foreign policy as being values-driven, I did mention this before, regardless of government in power. Speaking to the theme of this panel and where the conference is taking place, how do you see Canada, a Western liberal democracy, balancing its desire to pursue both its interests and to maintain its values in the Middle East? How might this balance be maintained? I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for having me and having me on the panel. And I'm sorry I'm here virtually. I hope you can see me okay. I can't see the panel anymore, so I'm just assuming everything is okay.
Everything's okay, yeah.
Look, I think you always have to pursue your values and your interests. The challenge is kind of navigating through. And so I would make a couple of observations, I think, for Canada at this point. One is to recognize that, we're in a changed world. We may still be members of the same organizations and living in the same geography. And by that, I mean, we cling very closely to the G7 and to NATO and maybe even to the G20. And these are memberships and geographies in which we feel comfortable. and where we think we have shared values. And just because we continue to be there doesn't mean that the world hasn't changed. So I think we need to recognize that there's a new geography at play. Countries where we would like to project our values are more independent, more pragmatic. And there is not a model in the world that there's a consensus around. So it's a very different world. So I think that's kind of number one. Number two, I think you pursue your values over the long term. And so you've got to make an investment for outcomes. And those outcomes on values may not be immediate. You know, it takes a long time to change something on human rights, or it takes a long time to change something. So you've got to be prepared to invest in the long term in order to make a difference. And then third, I think there's a difference between having your say and being heard. And I think too often lately, Canada is guilty of what I call Canada-splaining. And we're continually lecturing to people, having our say, feeling good about it, and then kind of standing and waiting for things to change. And I don't think that can work, and it's not going to help advance our values. I think instead, you have to be heard. And in order to be heard, you actually have to be engaged and at the table, and you have to invest in the relationships where you want to be heard. And if you are engaged, then you have to have some credibility. And I think it would help Canadian credibility if we would invest in better relations generally in the countries where we want some value outcomes. And I'm talking about maybe the Gulf region, I'm talking about Asia. And we would have more credibility if we were actually investing in the things that we said we were committed to. We'd have much more credibility at the table if we were living up to our NATO commitment of 2% defense spending, if we were living up to our commitment on development assistance, if we were living up to our commitment on climate change. We're very ambitious on those things, but we don't necessarily make the investment, and that doesn't help our credibility. And then finally, I think in today's world, you have to learn to be what I call diplomatically and intellectually uncomfortable. I think in today's world, you cannot have the luxury of picking perfect friends. You have to deal with the UAE, you have to deal with Saudi Arabia, you have to deal with India and others as they are, which is not to say we compromise, but we actually have to engage them so that we can be heard. And we have to focus on real targets and outcomes. And we have to play hardball as well. I do believe, as the previous speaker said, that we should actually for once be serious about development assistance. We don't tackle corruption. We don't tackle human rights abuses when we talk about development assistance. So I think we do need to take some tough decisions and be serious about our development assistance. But most importantly, you can't promote your values if all you're doing is, I think, stating them without engaging with some credibility. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to quickly follow up with one very quick question for you. I liked your comment, Canada-splaining. I hadn't heard that before. When Canada is Canada-splaining its values, what are those values?
Well, it's a good question. Maybe my panelists will help me, but, we tend to speak very strongly about human rights. We will speak very strongly and rightly about a feminist foreign policy. We will speak very strongly, I think, about the need to make a carbon transition and climate change. But I'll give you an example. We have been very vocal about a feminist foreign policy. I'm not sure how credible that is when we and other NATO countries abandoned girls and women in Afghanistan after a 20-year investment. And, to continue to rise and have selfies with hashtags that says we stand with you, I don't think is very credible. I think it'd be better to send our aid workers there to actually stand with the Afghans and have an impact on the ground and bear witness ourselves so that we can speak forcefully about the values we care about that are being eroded in that country.
Thanks very much. Andrea, you folks can't see it, but Peggy mentioned it. There's a light that is really taking out our eyes there. And so I'll look briefly towards you, but I'm probably going to keep looking away, not out of impoliteness. Now I can't even see my question. All right, the values taking place, the conference is taking place in Canada again. I've already mentioned that. And we often refer to our foreign policy being values driven, and we just got like a sense of what those current foreign policy values might be, or our values as Canadians. And it tends to change by government. So even if the government refers to values, for example, if we have a conservative government next, it will have different values. If we have an NDP government, it might have different values, regardless of the government in power. So whether well-earned today or not, Canada also has a long-standing international image as a peacemonger and human rights defender, and just generally as a defender of liberal internationalist values that became quite prominent after World War II with the formation of the United Nations and response to global fascism and the Allies defeating fascists. So speaking to the theme of the panel and where it is taking place, how do you see countries in the West that consider themselves to be liberal democracies like Canada balancing their desire to pursue both their interests and to maintain their values in the new Middle East? Do you yourself consider there to be a distinction between values and interests? And if there were to be one, what do you think should be prioritized over the other? And maybe there isn't a difference.
Thank you so much. It's a really rich question. I'm going to try to be brief, though, because if you've made it this far, you're probably really interested in this topic. So hopefully all of you have some things to say as well. So indeed, I do not think there is a difference between values and interests, though I do think that people use those terms for politically expedient purposes. I would ask for Western liberal democracies, how can the protection and promotion of universal human rights not be both a value and in those countries' interests? I think the answer is that, of course, they're aligned. Although I would note, too, that values, the term values anyway, can be performative. Although I live in Washington, my career has been in the US. I'm actually a dual citizen. I spent 12 years growing up in Toronto, and I moved there when I was 11. And I was shocked to find that Canadians were just as racist as Americans, but they were very polite about it because the multicultural value overrode the sort of day-to-day, it's sort of like a social nicety that the same feelings were there, the same sentiments, the same policies, similar, though not identical histories, but it was impolite to say it out loud, right? So I think that's an example where the value of multiculturalism, which is very valuable and is really embedded in a lot of Canadian society, was performative. It was an excuse. People used it to avoid addressing the underlying issues. So I do think that sometimes that can be the case with values in general. But when I think the difference between values and interests are used by governments ordinarily to mean that if something is in the state's interest, it's a short-term interest. And if it's a value, it's a long-term interest. And so there are some examples that I would think about where the states will set aside their values because of a short-term interest. And a lot of my work has been in the post-9/11 period. The action by the US government, the detention, rendition, interrogation program, torture of detainees. We've talked a little bit about Iraq today. The US and NATO, as many of you know, entered into a war with Iraq based on false information obtained from someone who was tortured by Egyptian security forces, something I always talk about because I work on Egypt a lot these days. And Canada is well aware of similar experiences with the scandal related to Afghan detainee abuse and the Maher Arar case where the Canadians really grappled with their own participation in this. This was an instance of nations saying that their short-term interest allowed them to abandon their values. Now look at where we are and look at what 20 years of antagonistic counterterrorism policy has led to when you look at the way the West engages with the Middle East and with Afghanistan. Clearly, that sort of conduct was not in the West's interests, neither long-term nor arguably short-term. But that language of set aside the values for short-term interests was an excuse, really, for what people wanted to engage in. So As I said at the outset, short form, I think they're the same, but I think that very few people will say that out loud because calling values and interests different things allows you to engage in some of that political chess, which usually government officials, I'm sure present company accepted, engage in on a day-to-day basis. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrea. Very quick comment, too, just following up on that and that sort of application of values. I'm teaching a foreign policy course right now, and I can't keep up with the Canadian government at the moment, I'll be honest with you. So we were going to look a lot at maybe India again this week. Then something happened in Parliament that might upset that. This being said, Canada, behind the recent sort of chaos, has been dealing with the potential situation that the government of India carried out a targeted assassination in Canada. But one point that's been raised, and then this is even within the context of international law, which I'm much weaker at than others, that, well, the West has already been using targeted assassinations, and in fact, often these have been celebrated by some Western analysts. So what happens then when a global South country decides to do the same to someone they consider a terrorist in Canada? Could you see could this be a result of that slide that you observed over your career?
So this would probably require a week-long conference, but I'll say in short that although I disagree with the US and other countries and their purported legal rationale for engaging in targeted killings, their purported legal rationale had to do with being in a state of armed conflict, which is not at all present in the situation here. Assassination is not actually an international legal term. And I think that one thing that you'll find very often when countries, including Western countries, engage in all sorts of illegal acts, often by their clandestine services, all of those activities are illegal. The countries do them anyway, but they take on the risk that their employees will be prosecuted. So I think it's a very different situation. What it is to me is something that Tim and others in my organization have been working extensively on in the U.S. is an instance of transnational repression, where governments, often governments like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia, like China, potentially India, in this circumstance, reach outside of their borders to engage in repression of either their citizens or people who support their citizens. Sometimes it's just family members. Sometimes the person is in the country, they might already be in detention, but these governments decide to harass their family members. Sometimes it's because people are outspoken, not just in those countries, but in the US or in Canada. There are several cases of transnational repression occurring here in Canada as well. So I think that's probably the better legal framework, although that itself is not actually a firm legal framework, and we're active in Washington trying to get the U.S. government, trying to get Congress to adopt a more robust legal framework for addressing transnational repression as a somewhat unique crime.
Thank you. Finally, Michael, definitely I will avoid saying that sentence again. And last but not least, I was going to say, but speaking to that point about the conference, where it's taking place, values, and then speaking to the theme of this panel, how do you see countries in the West, maybe that's we, right? Maybe not, that consider themselves to be liberal democracies like Canada, balancing their desire to pursue both their interests and to maintain their values in the Middle East? What role do communities and the general public play within this balance? And I say communities, those of you that are less familiar with it, we often use that term in Canada in fields like politics, political science, political studies, whatever you want to call it, to refer to ethnic communities that have often recently migrated to Canada, sometimes not, like in the case of the Ukrainians in Canada. Michael, please, go ahead.
I'd like to thank the Institute, panelists, all of you for being here and this opportunity, this invitation for this conversation. And I'd like to pick up on a few themes like honesty and trying to be heard by not Canada-splaining and not trying to weave between the lines of playing off values and interests from my fellow panelists, because, on the issue of honesty and when it comes to liberal democracy, and I'll take this as a conversation about efforts to promote liberal democracy in whatever myriad forms they happen in all types of engagement and interactions in foreign policy spaces in the Middle East and West Asia. We're good at owning the potential of liberal democracy. We're really robust in speaking about it. We're really bad about acknowledging its embedded limitations, right? And this is, let me geek out for 1 second here. We go into these conversations with really implicit assumptions about liberal democracy, about the individual in society, individual connected to the Bill of Rights and other types of things, as if, it applies in our own societies, let's say in the West, in longer running liberal democracies, but in a way that doesn't acknowledge groups, doesn't acknowledge peoples in a certain way, is really ironic. And it's also belied by the fact that right now some of the biggest books in this space are about how established liberal democracies meet the challenge of being diverse in their own societies. What are they acknowledging? When you have titles like Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart, that are speaking about long established liberal democratic experiments, it's an acknowledgement that groups, elements of society, peoples of society have always been part of that fabric and can't be invisibilized in how it's working. And so how is it that we, quote unquote, deliver democracy? How is it that we talk about it? How is it that we speak about it, engage in these spaces, if we're not honest about the fact that we're facing challenges ourselves with it, right? If foremost experts on the American democratic experiment are not taking it for granted, how do we go into these spaces taking it for granted in a way that this is a model that works, right? So if there is a way to re-envision and reimagine and then make that applied in building out programs to engage on these issues, even programmatically, in a way that says, we face this challenge, you're facing this challenge, it's real, and we want to work on it together. Now, I don't want to suggest equivalence. Let me be explicit. I'm not saying Canada and Iraq are the same, for example, right? Or Egypt. But going into a conversation saying, we think this is the best model, it reflects values and interests, but being honest in the conversation so that we're not Canada-splaining, trying to rope in every reference from my fellow panelists, we hopefully build that area of trust, as Arif was saying, that allows us to have a genuine conversation. So, now, is it being done? And I was teasing by saying we're in Canada, but I will be, I will refer to Canada, and I hope all of you will forgive me. This is not a shameless plug, but the program that I manage runs a flagship project called the Global Pluralism Monitor. It's funded by GAC, IDRC, so Global Affairs Canada, IDRC, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung supported part of it. This project looks at identity, looks at diversity, looks at these issues as being very real in all societies, including Canada. One of the countries assessed under the Global Pluralism Monitor project is Canada, that acknowledges this. If we go into those conversations saying, look, we have challenges too, it opens up that space. It opens up that ability to connect. It makes it more real. To be explicit about it, three, and relevant to the space that we're in right now, 3 of the countries assessed under the Global Pluralism Monitor project are Tunisia, Jordan, and Iraq. And in Tunisia, looking at migration, but when you're looking at migration from sub-Saharan Africa, it's also embedded and intersectional with that is issues of race, but also religion and an urban-rural divide. In Jordan, it's legal status, its origins or ethnocultural identification and religion. And in Iraq, it's religion, ethno-linguistic groups, and indigeneity. How can we not, in our own here in this space, we are in Canada, not acknowledge we can relate to those challenges now? We don't need to be shy, be timid about saying we think this is something that channels the best of interest and the best of values, and yet in a way that has its own challenges that we face too, and we can have an honest conversation about that. My own experience before I joined the center coming to this space, I worked I was a project director for the Iraq Sustainable Democracy Project. I was one of the first representatives for the Iraq Minorities Council which are independent parliamentarians elected to the first parliament in Iraq. And you know, whether it was extending parts of the Constitution that had to do with some of the most vulnerable populations, whether it had to do with setting up security arrangements, whether it had to do with how financing and the budget was being developed and put together, there were a lot of gaps. There were a lot of huge problems. And yes, the US, also the EU, UNAMI were key partners, key sources to talk. But, you know, where was Canada? Where were others? They were there. You could talk to them. But what was their ability to pick up on those spaces that other partners could not, other actors in the area could not, but that could also take forward the very kind of values and understandings that we were talking about? So now, about the last part of that question, I think, Andrea, if I can borrow your phrase, that's another week-long conference. What can communities here do about that? You know, I really have to say, I'm going on a slight tangent, forgive me, but, you know, I'm born here, but my family is from Iraq. And it was a constant challenge to navigate that space of being in diaspora, but echoing what is realistic on the ground, not succumbing to what could become, and I don't want to be pejorative about it, what could become disconnected or fanciful thinking in diaspora that perhaps your own populations in the countries don't resonate with or don't share, but at the same time carry the values and the aspirations that they represent. And I think that has to be, there needs to be a way, and I think it's a huge challenge, especially for Canada, in how we understand our commitment to multiculturalism, of which immigration and all that is such a big part, which is also part of our interest. No one is shy about saying immigration is central to our interest, but it's core to our values. There's the Global Pluralism Monitor report for Canada identifies how robust, even when there's been institutional criticism from robust sectors of society for immigration and multiculturalism, it's still robustly supported popularly in Canada. And yet we're going to have to navigate the space that these communities are bringing the legacies, the trauma, the hurt, but also the benefit of growing and being here. I'm a living example of that. So how we have those conversations, I think, can still resonate with being true that there are challenges here. We're not perfect. I don't want to be rhetorical about it, being real about it. What are those challenges, and how do those challenges create the space for an honest conversation when we're in West Asia or the Middle East, also talking about what liberal democratic institutions can do?
Brilliant. I could have also said we're in Turtle Island, be another way to say it, in which case this multiculturalism that I think most Canadians broadly are very comfortable with and support and actually promote and want. But there is a community that is excluded, and also we have maybe another nation in Canada, of Quebec, that has a different perception of this. So we're almost speaking to English Canada, right, when we do that, even though English Canada is incredibly diverse. And I'm just thinking about this question there, and very briefly, before we go into the other questions about diversity, I like that a lot. Do you see an element, and this is maybe that north-south divide, of chauvinism in Canada and in the West, to assume that we maybe accept multiculturalism, that we discovered it like it's something new, and then we look at more ancient societies that have, the Middle East was multicultural for so long, right, and almost isn't. It's become less homogenous as a result of the post-World War I colonial era. Do you see any sort of maybe hypocrisy here and then in our approach? And I use that theme of hypocrisy because that's important when we consider like the multipolar world and how the West is viewed in Global South.
So that's a loaded question.
Another conference.
Okay, I will take from that in the spirit of genuine conversation. I mean, hypocrisy, I think, conveys a lot of intent, right? You understand one thing, but you're going to patently do something else to the contrary. You know, I'll take a finding from the Global Pluralism Monitor report on Canada and indigeneity. So, you know, despite very popular support for multiculturalism, even in the face of, for example, established media criticism of multiculturalism. It's still robustly supported. I want to pick up on what Andrea identified, because the report identified it too, which is it can create blind spots, right? So we perception survey after perception survey shows that we actually have, Canadian society writ large has a very high regard for itself, but also in that high regard and through support for these types of policies, doesn't recognize what's happening within, for example, ethno-racialized minorities. One of the key findings there is that close to a majority, if not more, in terms of the survey data that was referenced in the study, see Indigenous peoples in Canada as just another ethnic group, right? As opposed to an Indigenous people with constitutionally enshrined rights that do require, and Indigenous peoples in Canada are advancing nation-to-nation status and Indigenous resurgence. How can we have a conversation with that when we're blind to it because of the narrative that we've bought into? Now, how much of that is intentional, making it hypocritical, and how much of that is the real work of shifting the conversation to expand understanding, expand horizons? And guess what? That makes us relatable to other places. I mean, we're doing work in Colombia right now with Indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombian work in the 20 countries that have been assessed. That's a starting point for our conversation, that we have these challenges too. Again, never to suggest equivalence, but just to say there's a ground for truth, honesty, and empathy.
One point, we weren't allowed to use the word empathy in political science. All right, I'm trying to look at this with these lights blinding me every time I want. I'm gonna ask you folks, good folks, one question, and we're not forgetting about you, Arif, online, on the monitor. I'll ask you one question, and then we'll shift to the audience and give everybody a chance to jump in. It's the end of the day. Maybe everybody wants to jump in right now, but I'm gonna ask you one question because that's kind of leading us into thinking about the multipolar world. So I'm gonna ask you the question. Number 5 I sent you. With a more multipolar world coupled with increasing influence of China in the region, some of the Middle Eastern countries are now developing an appetite for the Chinese model of governance. So we're looking at different values, that question of hypocrisy I brought in on purpose. So like a Chinese model with a high degree of political centralization, control of significant economic decentralization and development, as opposed to Western-led democratic governance long advocated by the US and its Western allies. How do you analyze this growing appetite in the region? Why is this happening, and how should the West approach this in the region? So this is a question for everybody on the panel, and I'll apologize if we can keep it to like 2-minute responses, just to give the audience a chance to ask a question. Thanks. Who would like to go first? And I can't see you, Arif, online. Should I let you go first if you want to, just because I can't see you raise your...
Sure, I'm happy to go first. Look, I think people prefer a different model because this will be controversial, but I think it works better than the other models so far. I don't think people in the Gulf, which is an area that I concentrate on, are choosing a quote Chinese model. I think they're choosing a model that's unique to them. These are monarchies that have certain traditions and cultures of governing. They're small populations generally, except for Saudi Arabia. When I was there, the model they would try to emulate was more the Singapore model, and I think that's different. So I think it would be too easy to just say it's an authoritarian model. I think second, our arguments would be stronger if our 50 to 70 years of development assistance in our model had kind of achieved some results that I think were noteworthy. I think it's been very patchy. I think other countries, I was recently in Rwanda, which has a very authoritarian model, has been through a genocide 30 years ago, but is probably the most developed, economically stable country in Eastern Africa. So, these models challenge us because they seem to get results. And the final observation I'd make is, I think the challenge we have right now is there isn't a consensus on a model. Clearly, many countries are not aspiring to look like Western Europe or North America, and they're changing, and they're looking for their own model. So again, I think we're going to have to be try to be comfortable with that, and at the same time, I think it's entirely legitimate for us to remind people as they pursue their model that there are certain universal human rights, that there are certain codes of conduct for governance of your own society, and we will find ways to make those issues accountable, whether it's how we trade with you, how we lend with you, or how we provide grants to you. But that's very different, I think, than focusing always on the word democracy. I think we have to have room for people to choose a different model.
Thanks so much. Who would like to go next? Andrea?
Sure, happily. I think it's important to recognize as well that democracy is flawed. The best democracies are flawed, and then even relatively functioning democracies, such as the one I live in. I live in a country where the man responsible for an armed insurrection is about to run for president again. And that's just it's something that millions and millions of Americans support. So it's not, a niche issue. So I do think we need to be mindful about what we want to support. And I think I agree with the ambassador that Middle Eastern countries are not looking for a particular model. They're looking for a way to continue to exert power over their populations. And autocracies in particular, and I don't use that word to apply to every Middle Eastern country at all, but those that are autocracies look to China and see a government that has been successful economically while engaging in mass human rights abuses, and has effectively gotten a free pass when it comes to those mass human rights abuses. So overall, and succeeded in placating much of its population with economic prosperity. So I think they see the possibilities there, and the alliances with China. So they're not left alone, right? If they follow a Chinese model and they can partner with China, then they have a significant trade partner and so on. So I think it's quite attractive, but I don't think that the model is the problem. I think it's the notion that autocracies, that regimes that benefit from subjugation or the deprivation of rights of their people want to continue to persist in that. And that's why, to a certain extent, we're talking about government-to-government relations. We're not talking about people and government-to-people relations. And I think if I'm wrong and values and interests are different things, I would say that values are often about speaking directly to the people, and interests are about governments speaking to other governments. So the government interest is with what the other government wants to do, but its values have to do with how it treats the people in those countries and supports the people in their own decision-making about what they want to see for themselves, rather than the top-down imposition of whatever governmental structure they have now.
Thanks so much. Timothy, please.
Sure, thanks. Just to piggyback on Andrea's point, I think consent of the government is actually a really important part to consider here. I would be cautious about talking about this is the Saudi cultural model for governing is a monarchy. I mean, these are all very new monarchies for the most part. I mean, with the exception of perhaps Morocco. Well, not perhaps Morocco. Morocco's monarchy is really old. But I mean, some of them are colonial creations, like Jordan, for example. These are relatively novel creations in the political space, and I think that while the Cold War axis of competition was between capitalism and communism, I know we say democracy and class, but realistically, what we have now, I think, is with the China model, or if you want to call it that, or kind of a regime-led market economic structure that pursues domination over its population and forceful domination. I mean, if this was really like something that the population wanted, then they wouldn't have to imprison lots of people. They wouldn't have to surveil them on this scale. They wouldn't have to do all this repression. And in some of the Gulf states, they don't have to do it as much. And that's partly because they can deliver a lot of economic support, something that was alluded to earlier today. Whereas in the model of these regime-led market and regime-dominated markets, in the non-oil exporting countries and the non-energy exporting countries, the model has failed to deliver economically for the population. It's failed to deliver on the aspirations of the population. And the result is the populations are oftentimes quite upset with their governments, and that results in those governments responding by a variety of damaging counter-revolutionary practices that harm the population, repress the population, and seek to silence and suppress it, which is why you have ambassadors pretending they don't know who's running for president in 2 months. But like, I mean, but the reality is that I think we can differentiate those things. Democracy isn't coming from external pressure. Canada's not going to make anyone a democracy. The United States is not going to make anyone a democracy. The European Union is not going to make anyone a democracy. That's not really what we're talking about here. We can talk about more basic aspirations. I think that there's also this kind of false dichotomy of like values means we're like exporting democracy. No, values means that if we're going to give you money, we want to make sure that the money doesn't get spent on enriching like a few generals at the expense of the population and damaging the country's long-term prospects and weakening it geopolitically. I mean, you can be a little bit more practical and pragmatic about how your values and interests can come together. I think that sometimes these things get a little too blown out of proportion. One last thing, I think that what we're experiencing right now with the challenge in terms of like the diversification of alliances has to do with the fact that while in the Cold War period, the non-aligned countries were often lacked the capital to actually be non-aligned. They often had external dependence. Now we have countries that really can be non-aligned. They have the capital to be non-aligned, and that was a fundamentally different part of the equation before. So the Saudis are non-aligned. They are not in anyone's particular orbit. The Indians are non-aligned. The Emiratis are non-aligned, and that's not a criticism of them. It's just a reality, and it makes sense for them, I'm sure. But it just, acknowledge that reality, that they're no longer in your orbit. They're independent actors, engage with them as such, and they will always hedge their bets and balance based on their interests, which, again, is what most states do.
Michael.
I'll keep it quick because the panelists have really covered everything else. So it's just to pick up from what was said and say, I was listening to a speaker from newly established Global South Studies Institute saying on that non-alignment and current economic development, really through globalization that has opened up some empowerment in these spaces, certainly applicable to West Asia, that there's a choice now. And in a multipolar world where polarity is fracturing and diversifying itself, that it's in their interest to nurture that space because it gives them more options, it gives them more space. And so I would just conclude by saying, when you're dealing with actors who benefit actively, really, in their interest, in their capacity to make decisions as sovereigns in this multipolar space, and you want to come in with conversations that are not honest, it's even easier to tune out. So everyone else has covered the real interest in it, and I would just echo what I said earlier, and then you're coming into the conversation where it's frankly not that sincere, it can just shut it down completely.
Thanks so much. Okay, maybe we have a generous 6 and maybe several more minutes if we're lucky for any questions from you. Does anybody have any question? And I know we're at the end of a long day. Do values matter?
Yes.
It's like something I would ask at my class. Do values matter? Peggy, I bet you have an opinion. Oh, we do have a question. Brilliant.
Yeah, is this on? I can ask a question. To inform myself, I'm not a Middle East specialist. My name is Leah Hiltz. I work with Global Affairs. Very interesting. This debate is something that we hear in the halls, values, interests. Where's the balance? Do we need to drop values or do things in a different way? Sometimes it feels like a very bipolar conversation. And I was curious about the view from civil society in the Middle East. I know this isn't something we can speak generally on in 5.5 minutes that are left, but are there trends or areas where a values-based foreign policy does make sense in the current environment?
And Arif, since you're online, should I give you a chance to jump in first if you wanted to respond? Or
Thanks. Look, I can't speak for civil society in the Gulf. First, it's very limited, as others will point out. But I do point to a survey that I've seen year after year after year, I think probably for almost a decade, in which Arab youth are asked, where in the world would you like to be? Where do you want to live? And overwhelmingly, they name Dubai or the Emirates. And I think that shouldn't be discounted. Arab youth are saying that with all of its faults, that's a model that speaks to us. more than wanting to live in New York or Paris or wherever else. So there are a lot of problems in these countries, but I think the question really is, is how do you address them for outcomes? And, secondly, there are a lot of problems, but it seems to me that the trajectory is in the right way. So I think it's always a balance. I don't think countries deal with each other very differently than people deal with each other. I don't think all of our friendships are based on either or, all or nothing relationships. We tend to accept certain characteristics and try to change others. So I think that's where we have to go. I think civil society has a long way to go in the Gulf countries where I work most often. But I actually see a lot of hope even there, and I think it's because we need to continue to engage these countries without, as I say, kind of lecturing to them. And I am going to patent Canada-splain.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, just briefly in response to that, I think the civil society organizations that I work with want to know that Western countries stand with them and not with their governments. And I'll give you an example. The ambassador mentioned having to deal with countries as they are, but not compromise. As you probably know, COP28 is coming up. COP27 was held last year. The UN Climate Conference was held last year in Egypt. And it was a really tremendous opportunity for civil society organizations and individuals to come together, because organizations like mine, which do not work on environmental issues, were able to align with climate activists and the recognition that you can't have climate justice when you don't have other justice, when climate rights activists are among the tens of thousands of unjustly detained down the road from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. But the U.S. made a series of, I think, really terrible choices in the way that it handled its presence at COP27, and I'll just give you an example. Nobody expected, although I think some of us called for the president not to attend, but no one expected that to happen. But President Biden attended, then Secretary Nancy Pelosi attended, Secretary Blinken, very senior U.S. officials. And the public statements by the president, there was no mention of human rights whatsoever. The National Security Advisor gave a press briefing and talked about specific political prisoner cases, including naming individuals, saying, we, the United States, are asking for certain people to be released. But all that any civil society activist talked about were the pictures of the president clapping Sisi on the back, Nancy Pelosi hugging him, closely as they walked down the hall. People would show me their phones. They would say, look, this is what happened. Who cares that Jake Sullivan told a bunch of reporters on Air Force One that the U.S. is going to ask for the release of people, all of whom are still detained, by the way, the ones whose release were requested in November as well as earlier. So it's that kind of engagement that civil society is asking for, which is not actually a policy change. I don't think that, although there are many requests of Egyptian civil society, for example, that are encompassed by that story, the decision to have the photographs spread around the world on Twitter and Instagram and so on to be one of a U.S. government official standing with a human rights activist instead of with an autocrat. That's a choice that the government made, and it has real-world implications. So to a certain extent, again, I don't want to generalize either, but I think it's that kind of engagement that civil society in the Middle East is looking for, even if the underlying policies may not be changed. It's about a moral alignment rather than the day-to-day policies, although those matter a great deal as well.
So government to government, people to people, almost between your responses.
Well, government to people.
Okay.
Right? That's what seems to be missing, the idea that governments only engage with other governments, and if you have a bad actor, then you're only engaging with a bad actor. What about all of the people who that government doesn't represent?
We have to end, but we have time. Let's maybe Timothy and Michael, if you can quickly respond.
Sure. I think on the civil society front, we work with a lot of civil society organizations as well. It's much, compared to 20, 30 years ago, because of technology and where we're at, it's really easy to engage with them and know what they're asking for. It's an imperfect system. Civil society groups, of course, are self-selecting, and they're not like elected officials, so they represent particular views and perspectives. But there's certainly a much better vantage point than just depending on your context with your counterparts, who obviously have a vested interest in preserving the status quo and protecting themselves. So I would encourage that. But at the same time, as someone who talks to a lot of governments and international institutions that want to talk to civil society also needs to see that you're actually going to do something with what they tell you. There is a really big challenge in convincing them to talk, because, for example, in the countries that we're talking about, it's physically dangerous to talk to government officials. I mean, for example, in Egypt, there were a bunch of human rights defenders that were put in prison because they addressed a bunch of Western ambassadors. And to this day, they're banned. That was 3 years ago. To this day, they're banned from travel, their assets are frozen, and they have terrorism charges that they're facing. But the French president said that he freed them a month later while standing next to Sisi in the Élysée Palace before he gave him the highest civilian honor in the country. Thank you. So, I mean, a little sincerity in the engagement, a little more taking seriously of responsibility when you're engaging with civil society. Some anti-retribution policies would be nice with certain international institutions. A little bit, yeah. I think there's steps that can be taken. We can talk more about it later because I know we're out of time.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Leah, is it right? Because, again, everything that was just said, and I'll make it a little bit operational, again, from my experience in Iraq and other spaces. Building off of what was just said, also reach and connect with them to support them in their efforts actively. In a lot of these spaces, governments, for example, mediate what is a legitimate registered civil society organization. That becomes a source of leverage. That becomes a source of hegemonic action that can control and lead to civil society that obscures the situation. And so how do you penetrate through that, through those conversations, by connecting, maybe using civil society actors here? We talked about communities here. How do you get past a barrier of civil society that exists that somehow, or at times can be part of formal regulations, formal systems of operating that can make the connection you develop with them less than ideal. And that's certainly what happened with civil society in my experience in Iraq. There was a host of civil society, robust civil society organizations that were not allowed to be registered, that were not allowed to be legally recognized, and it prevented them from becoming part of social transformation. And in the end, I'll just conclude by saying, we all know that social transformation happens in these societies by the members of those societies. It's not the programs, it's not the aid, that's support, but we're talking about that kind of support. So yeah, the ability to connect on a genuine level with the understandings that were spoken about civil society significance.
I'm sorry to end this panel now. It's brilliant listening to all four of you speak. I think we could go on and on, but we can't go on, and you folks have been here all day. So thank you very much. And I think we have the networking reception in about 10 minutes. So again, thanks to the brilliant panelists.
I'll be super quick with my closing remarks, and thanks very much, Jeremy, and also to our speakers for this wonderful panel, also to Arif, who joined us earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, thank you for joining us today for the Third Middle East Strategy Forum. I hope our discussion today have broadened our understanding of the multifaceted dynamics of the Middle East, particularly as we're moving toward a more multipolar order. As we are closing this session, I'm truly grateful for the esteemed speakers, participants, and our dedicated team at IPD for making this forum a reality. I would like to also take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank our sponsors for this year's conference, the Minds program at the Canadian Department of National Defense, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council through their Connection Grant Program, and the Open Society Policy Center in the US. In the shifting sands of the global geopolitics, dialogue remains our most important tool. Let us continue to engage in constructive discourse and seek engagement and solutions that prioritize peace and diplomacy over confrontation and isolation. With that, let me thank you once again on behalf of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for your active participation, and hope to see you all next year here in Ottawa at the 4th Annual Middle East Strategy Forum. Thank you.